I know there's a lot of information from the near-death experience research where people can bring back information. And there's also the data, the information from children who remember their previous lives and can also speak to the process before they incarnated. How did you tap into this information, or how did you come to understand this?
When my own mother was dying in 2002, I had been studying medical intuition for probably 10 years. I've been on this journey for about 30 years. And I'm a businesswoman and an inventor of surgical devices sold throughout the world. And when I was interested in it and started studying it, my family and friends would say, "Why are you doing that?" I'd say, "I don't know. I don't know. It's just interesting." 6 years I did it and paid the equivalent of a PhD or an MD to study this
Wow.
stuff. And they'd say, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "It's just, I find it fascinating." So I was being led. I know that now because now I do this full time and I have for about 5 years. But when my own mother was dying, Derek, I had been studying this stuff for about 10 years and I'd never been around anybody who had died before. So when we drove all night, she lived in Columbus, Ohio, where I was born and raised, and I live in Birmingham, Alabama. So my husband, my young son, he was 10 at the time, and this was 20 years ago, we drove all through the night to get to her because that was the fastest way for us to get there. I couldn't get a flight up there faster than we could
Hmm.
drive. It's a 10-hour drive. So
Yeah.
we got there at about 10 in the morning, and she recognized that we were there, but she just wasn't really able to communicate. And she had been moved into a hospice facility, an inpatient hospice facility. And all the rest of my family was there, my siblings, their spouses, some of my nephews were there. My dad was there. And when I walked in the room, we all said our hellos. And then my dad was reading out of this prayer book. I was raised Roman Catholic. And my dad was reading out of this prayer book that was Prayers for the Dying. I'd never heard of it, let alone had I ever heard any of the prayers out of it, but it was very nice. So I closed my eyes, and I see things in my mind's eye telepathically. And I saw this iridescent mist floating through the room. And when he stopped saying the prayers, it stopped. And then later, about an hour later, we said the rosary, and that iridescent mist came back. And I thought, okay, this must be what they call grace. And I thought, I wonder what else I'm going to be able to see in my mind's eye as she goes through this dying process. And so it was really interesting. I kind of felt like a schizo at the time because on one side of the equation, my heart was breaking because my mother was dying.
Right.
And on the other side, I was fascinated by what was happening from an energetic and a spiritual perspective. And so that's how the 12 phases came about. And that's what I talk about in my book, Angelic Attendants, is what happened with my mother when I was with her. That was the first time I'd seen that. And then I go through in detail what the different phases are. And then there are lots of stories in there of families with whom I've worked, and they're really heartwarming and really miraculous in a way. Some of them surprising. I have people say, "Well, gosh, I couldn't put it down." And that surprised them at how fun it was to read it, because the stories are just so amazing and you can't make this stuff up. It was
Yeah.
just remarkable.
I'm wondering about ghosts. Have you encountered people getting stuck in this process that become ghosts? Is that a thing?
That's not my perception of what happens. Yes, I've encountered lots of ghosts. And there's a chapter in my book called The Train
Ah,
Wreck, and it's full of ghosts, and it's really fun. And we were able to corroborate the information that we got with historic documents and through other means. Ghosts, everybody goes to heaven. There was a movie out, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, All Dogs Go to Heaven.
yes.
Well, all people go to heaven too. And and what I find is that spirits are escorted to heaven by angels. And then if their spirit wants to continue the human experience, but in spirit form, that's when they come back. And that's when we'll encounter what we call ghosts. And so it's fascinating. Most of the time, ghosts don't know they're dead.
Hmm.
When we incarnate, you mentioned children knowing past life information.
Yeah.
When we incarnate, we forget what our past lives were. And especially little children can still perceive them at times, but they start to shut that down about the age of about 6 or 7. So, like us, when we come in and we don't remember all the details of our past life, we're supposed to experience this life and go through all of the adventures of this life without being concerned about past lives. Past lives are really fun. I do that a lot with clients, and they can give us little snippets of information that help us make sense of what's happening in this life. And we can talk more about that later. But ghosts, like humans, I find they don't know they're dead, but their spirit knows, and their spirit wants to explore what it's like to be in non physical, but be in the human experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so what you're speaking to is ghosts don't know they're dead, but their spirit does. So when you say spirit, I assume you're talking about like a higher self, like some the ghost is a fragment of the total self of that soul.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Right. We're all spirits attached to a body having a human experience. Spirit and soul to me is the same thing. It's just semantics. It's the energy that's everlasting. And there are a lot of schools of thought that believe that we can be in multiple places at the same time. And a part of our spirit always is in non-physical, and then we're in the human experience too. So when somebody's dying, their human side perhaps doesn't realize that they're dying, especially in the case when somebody dies very suddenly, unexpectedly.
Mhm.
But the spirit always knows, because the spirit decides when we go, where we go, how we go, and who's with us or not when we go. All of that's determined by the spirit. And when the spirit and the body separate, the body doesn't work anymore, because the spirit is the power source for the body.
Mm.
And the interesting thing about our spirits deciding when, how, where, with whom, when we all transition or die, in other words, same thing. Ask any funeral director, ask any hospice nurse, ask any critical care medical provider, whether it be a doctor. It's usually more of a nurse. The doctors are kind of in and out quickly, but they have limitless stories about everybody sat with grandma for 2 weeks, and Aunt Susie was on duty, and she left the room for 3 minutes to go get a cup of coffee, and grandma transitioned. Grandma died while Aunt Susie was out of the room. Or the my dad waited until so and so got into town so he could say goodbye, and then he died 10 minutes later. I mean, there
Yeah.
are endless stories about that. So I think that's just validation that we all decide when and how we go.